So if in the chat you could drop your name, organization, and location, and actually Trista and Lenore, I see that you're the only ones here. So we're going to briefly, I'd like to know if you would raise your hand if you feel like you have a pretty consistent orientation and training program in place now. Or you can just come off mute. You're welcome to do that as well.
I don't know how to raise my hand, but
That's okay.
the answer is no on my part.
Okay, no on your part. And Trista, is that a...
We have it, but we're really working on updating it right now. We just started having our some of our graduates volunteer, and so to just be more like inclusive of them, we're really kind of updating all our orientation, and just to make sure we're kind of doing it the same way with everybody, I guess.
Oh, absolutely. I think that's something that's really important to consider as well, is making sure that that orientation is consistent for all of your volunteers, new and returning, and that we're making sure that we're doing that every time. So yeah, I think we're all in a great place to start today. Okay, so today we will review briefly the 12 elements of effective volunteer engagement, which are cornerstones for success for any volunteer engagement program. And then we'll introduce elements 5 and 6, orientation and training, and we'll also move into a brief question and answer with me at the end. So if you're joining us for the first time today, the 12 elements of volunteer engagement are essential practices that make a volunteer program most sustainable and effective. We have already covered planning, volunteer job descriptions, recruitment, screening, and placement. And those webinars can be found on the website if you missed them, as well as on our YouTube channel. But I do want to give just some very brief context to those elements. Strategically planning your volunteer program helps garner organizational support and creates a culture of overall positive volunteerism throughout our agencies. This also helps us develop mission-centered programs that are fundamental to our agency's operations. And we discussed volunteer job descriptions with Amy Pinger from Harvesters. She's also our commission chair. We know that well-written job descriptions set the expectations for both the volunteer and the agency, and creating great job descriptions proactively addresses many of the issues that could come up around supervision and management in the future. Great recruitment plans, which was highlighted by Cheryl Batchelor Booth with the American Red Cross, are strategic, and they utilize compelling messaging and a variety of platforms to reach your target audience to fulfill our agency's volunteer needs. Great recruitment doesn't just stop at advertisement, they also incorporate a focus on retention as well. And excuse me, that was Jess Bearclaw from United Way. We talked about screening and placement with Cheryl Batchelor Booth from the American Red Cross. Great screening lets us get to know our volunteers and really gives us an opportunity to understand their values, their personal mission, their goals, their skills, and assess all of those things about them and really find our best position for them within our agency. So our topic today is orientation and training. You can mark your calendars for our future webinars. We'll discuss recognition and acknowledgement in August, coordination and communication in September, record keeping and reporting in October, evaluation in November, and volunteer staff relations in December. And excuse me, I missed July. July will be supervision, next month's topic. So even though orientation and training are often used together or synonymously, they actually describe different parts of volunteer management. Volunteer orientation is an ongoing process of helping volunteers feel welcome when they come on board, and also gives an overview of the total organization. Volunteer orientation is necessary for every volunteer every time they come to your organization, regardless of specific assignment. It places the work into context and allows introduction for consistency of policies, procedures, rights, and responsibilities. So we want to be sure to kick off volunteer orientation before a volunteer is active in their role rather than after the fact or after they've already gotten started, not on the fly. I know a lot of us really like to work on the fly. We're really good at that as volunteer managers, but orientation is one of those things that we want to set upfront and intentional time for. A structured orientation is key to success here. So before we jump in with our volunteers to any role-specific training, we want to take a moment to formally welcome new volunteers to our organizations. The primary purpose of volunteer orientation is to acquaint our recruits with our organization, with our staff, our processes, and most importantly, our mission. Orientation should also provide context and purpose, give a brief history of the organization, help newcomers understand complexities of the needs and gaps that we're addressing organizationally in our community, and introduce client profiles where they're appropriate.
Can I ask you a question really quick?
Absolutely.
I'm so sorry, just so that I make sure that my terminology is correct. Is orientation the same thing as onboarding the volunteers?
Yes, that's correct. So
Okay.
those two are actually used pretty interchangeably, onboarding and orientation. And this on kind of the timeline of when this would happen would be after you've had kind of a concerted recruitment effort, or for some of us, a cold call. We get cold calls from volunteers still, right? Asking to volunteer with our organization. So some kind of recruitment events or efforts, and then screening and placement will happen. And now we're to that orientation. And orientation also, thank you for asking, Lenore, can be just one volunteer meeting with you one-on-one, totally appropriate, or some organizations like to do a group orientation as well, or onboarding, all the same thing, all equally important. So we may choose to do our orientation or our onboarding in person, like I said, or we may choose to do that online as well. Some of us are starting to work or continuing to work with virtual volunteers. If you are, then of course, it would be appropriate for your volunteers to have a virtual orientation or onboarding as well, or a combination of both. So even though orientation typically happens after the recruitment event, some sort of recruitment event that I mentioned, or concentrated recruitment effort and screening and placement, you can really think of this as a volunteer's first impression with your organization. This may be the first time a volunteer gets to take a deeper look at your organization rather than just kind of that high level view that they may get at a recruitment or tabling event or during the screening and placement process. A successful orientation will inform volunteers about your mission and vision and help them understand how their work as a volunteer makes the larger work of your organization possible. Orientation is the perfect opportunity to let volunteers know about the different volunteer opportunities available by discussing all of the programs your organization offers, not just the opportunity that initially sparked their interest. My very favorite way to talk about organizational programming is typically through a tour of the facility whenever that's possible during the onboarding process. I find this is a really great interactive way to acquaint volunteers with not only the space, but also a way to show off your program areas, to talk about the work that all of your specific programs do to impact the community. And it also gives you an opportunity to informally introduce them to team members you would encounter along the way during your tour. Orientation is a time to establish goals for volunteers, and often we kind of throw them right into the work, right? But I encourage you to look for ways to goal set with your volunteers in advance by asking your volunteers what they're looking to accomplish. This is an opportunity to find what a volunteer is really after by volunteering their time or serving with you, and find ways to deliver on both your organization's needs and those of the volunteers. For example, I come from a food bank background, and you may have, oh, excuse me, I love to do that. I don't know if you've noticed. I come from a food bank background, and you may have a volunteer who will typically work doing one specific thing, right? So you may know that their main responsibility in a food bank setting would be to be packing like supplemental nutrition boxes for seniors in a warehouse setting per se. But during orientation or onboarding, your volunteer might say one of their goals is to feel connected to the community. In that case, I'd ask the volunteer if they'd be interested in serving perhaps quarterly or with some frequency at a mobile distribution or with an agency partner's pantry, so that they're still meeting their goal of seeing the direct community impact of their service in addition to fulfilling the agency's need. Orientation is also a time, where were we, you all? I'm so sorry. I get so clicker happy. There we go. I think we're on the right slide. Does that look right to you? You can give me a nod if we went back to where we need to be. Okay, there we go. This is also going to be a time to mitigate any risk associated with the position. This may include safety training or safeguarding training or any other training that your organization requires that would set them up for success, set your volunteers up for success. Perhaps a sensitivity training if they'll be working with vulnerable populations as well. This is also a great time to go over your organizational chart to introduce and demonstrate the organization's hierarchy. It's important that volunteers know who to reach out to with questions and who to go to when they feel like they need support, as well as where they fit into the organization too. That's often helpful to mitigate any risks that come with supervision or management of volunteers when they understand their place in the organization up front. And finally, orientation is a time for you to continue learning about your new volunteers and to help empower them to make a difference by sharing your organization's community impact data as well. And that's something that you could, or perhaps is in your, your communication toolkit. If you have an overview that's already written with impact data that you can share with them, or perhaps it's something that you could pull from your annual report, just some blurbs, perhaps not the whole thing, but some blurbs to illustrate all of the great work that you're doing with your community. So here's a more specific look at what you want to include when you're building out your onboarding programming. We want to, of course, welcome volunteers with open arms to show gratitude for their support and genuinely get to know who they are and to create a warm environment. We want to share our organization's history, mission, and goals so that they have the most up-to-date information about what your impact looks like. And you might be surprised what people don't know yet. So sometimes we think that we know, volunteers know everything that we know about our programming, and that's often not the case. So this is really an opportunity to let them know, to show off everything that you're doing, all of your programs, all of the important data that you want people to know. So going deeper than the elevator pitch here. We also want to share their roles and responsibilities to establish expectations and guidelines. If anyone feels like they might not be a good fit for a role, this is a great way to figure that out. And of course, hopefully we figure that out during the screening and placement process. But again, we want to offer many opportunities to get to know them, for them to get to know us, and to be able to figure all of those moving pieces out. We want to show volunteers insights into the impact they'll help create. Everyone wants to make a difference, and this will get them inspired from the very first meeting. We want to introduce volunteers to staff and to fellow volunteers. Of course, the more familiar faces there are, the more connected people will feel to one another and to your mission. We want to review the volunteer handbook or manual, whatever information you have that you give volunteers to explain the policies and procedures, all of the technical pieces about volunteering, the ins and outs of your organization. Want to familiarize them with that information, including all of your policies. We want to make sure all of our volunteers, everyone is familiar with that. We want volunteers to have training on the legal parts of our policies. That's especially important. Then we'll discuss what job job-specific training will look like moving forward. So there may be some instances where your organization will plan an orientation or onboarding and training on the same day, moving from one right into the other, or this may happen, over a period of time in sort of a series. So be sure to discuss what the expectation is for training moving forward, and consider incorporating different learning styles so that everyone feels confident in their training as well. This could be another opportunity, if you haven't done it during screening and placement, to talk about how volunteers learn best so that you can have that in your mind moving forward. And we'll give volunteers a tour of the facilities where that's appropriate. Of course, some of us aren't able to show all of our buildings, especially if we've got residential facility with clients. But when that's appropriate, we want to give them a tour, and this will help keep volunteers from feeling like strangers in their roles, showing them where everything is, and empower them to do their best when they know what the available resources are as well. And we'll want to provide them with ways to keep in touch and ways that they can get ongoing support and give and get feedback. We want to keep communication open and make sure volunteers have a set point of contact and they know who that contact is for any questions or concerns. And then finally, something that sometimes we overlook, we want to ask for volunteers' input and feedback. Their experience in the role will help keep you on top of what's working in your organization and what could benefit from change. Of course, always really wonderful to have that firsthand feedback from volunteers. So moving on to our training portion, many volunteer roles require specific training that goes beyond just the simple orientation. That's where volunteer training program comes in. Training may vary, of course, with the demands of each specific position and the background each volunteer brings to the organization. It is important to provide a comprehensive initial training as well as ongoing training after the volunteer begins their service with you. Ongoing training could look like quarterly, monthly, however you want to incorporate that, continued learning activities, or you could do annual refreshers as well, whatever works for you and your organization. So before you implement your training program, we want to formulate a specific content plan. What do you want your volunteers to learn? How extensive will training be? And basic training usually covers the following information: how to communicate the organization's mission, very important. We want our volunteers to be able to talk competently about our organization and accurately. Goals for the activity and evaluation methods, how to perform the volunteer task, safety measures, rules for volunteering with your organization, especially for working with vulnerable populations. We want them to know exactly what our expectations are. An overview of any equipment that they'll encounter and how to use it, and how to submit their volunteer time. That's very important for you all, for your collecting data, for grant reporting, all of that. So we want to make sure that they're able to accurately submit their volunteer hours. And remember, orientation and training don't have to be in person. As I mentioned, online volunteer training is a cost-effective way that allows busy volunteers to learn in their own time. So some of you may have some pre-recorded training or orientation available. I think that's a great way to extend the capacity of your community engagement department as well. So virtual training offers flexibility, so the eager volunteers, we all have those, right? They want to get started right away, that they can get started in their own time. We can integrate virtual training elements into the onboarding process for a seamless transition so that it doesn't feel disjointed between in-person training and perhaps remote or virtual orientation or vice versa. So once a volunteer registers, if we have that opportunity for a virtual orientation or training, you can promptly provide them with instructions on how to access those trainings. And for more skilled volunteer roles, virtual volunteer training tends to work best when it's accompanied by a brief in-person session. You'll be able to answer questions as they arise naturally, which is always really comforting and nice. And you'll, of course, be able to engage in more meaningful conversation face-to-face. And of course, some role-specific training is best carried out in person, perhaps a CPR training or other technical trainings like that. So our goals for training are to build a volunteer's enthusiasm for our mission. And I think that really starts with our community engagement team, right? We're often the first people that a new volunteer sees with our organization, and often the most frequent contact for them. The volunteer orientation and training program offers a critical opportunity to share our team's passion and commitment to our community and to instill the same feelings for our volunteers. And people want to know that their work will make a difference, sharing stories of impacts and helps them make a direct connection between the impact of our own work and the work of the organization, inspires them to continue serving with our organizations. And we want to empower them by equipping our volunteers with all of the information, resources, and tools they'll need to succeed in their roles. We're empowering them to fulfill their duties with skill and with confidence. And speaking of confidence, it's critical that our volunteers feel ready to jump into their roles. And I feel like that starts with knowledge and regular access to support. So no matter what kind of role you're training your volunteers for, these are a few evergreen guidelines. I want to be clear and specific about their role. This is where those job descriptions that we discussed a couple of months ago fit in. This includes what responsibilities the volunteer has, what they are, and how it fits in with the broader event or program or with our overall organization. If there's an agenda, clearly identify where their task fits in here. We want to provide a range of resources and tools to empower them with the information they need to learn and to succeed. This could include the volunteer handbook that we discussed, or a floor plan and a walkthrough of the event space or your building space. And whenever possible, walk them through the specific tasks related to their role. Giving them space to practice builds confidence, of course. It helps when we repeat activities with learning, or at least for me. And that also helps troubleshoot any issues or questions on the spot as they're working through their task with you. Great training gives them access to key contacts for an open line of communication. Knowing who to go to with questions will reduce confusion and helps them feel supported. We want to encourage volunteers to engage with and support one another. And like I said, building community is a must-do, and it'll make our team feel all the more connected, both volunteers with staff and volunteers with other volunteers. And consider what information you would need to be successful in the same position or the same role. So put yourself in the volunteer shoes and consider what helped you when you first started training with a nonprofit. And if you had a rocky experience, what could have made it better? So consider those things and try to incorporate them upfront into your volunteers training. So a few tips for effective training when designing training procedures for your volunteers. We should also think in terms of talent development. The best thing you can do for your volunteers and for your organization is to find ways to maximize their skills and talents, just like we do with our regular teams or with our staff teams. So we have a few suggestions here, and one is to focus on their learning styles. Research suggests that people learn better with informal versus formal training or classroom style training. Peer-to-peer training is especially effective. So we're always having an opportunity to have other volunteers, veteran volunteers, or regulars to help us with our training. Sometimes partnering a new volunteer with a regular or repeat volunteer is especially helpful in helping make those connections, but also just really delivering the information in a comprehensive way, a comprehensive and meaningful way. We want to integrate practice into training, so go beyond simply sharing a description of a certain task. We want to explain the concepts, illustrate how to do the skill, and invite learners to try it and give feedback. A little replaying of this will go a long way. And it's important to make learning enjoyable, right? Training should be delivered in a relaxed atmosphere with a lot of opportunities for breaks, questions, and conversation. And of course, we don't want to overwhelm new recruits with too much information all at once. To help reduce information overload, consider removing any unnecessary content, right? So sometimes we might give them so much information up front that it's hard to parse that down or really identify the pieces that are important. We want to use plain language and avoiding blocks of text and written materials. Something that I also feel like I'm super guilty of, and I think some of my nonprofit colleagues are as well, is using really technical jargon or acronyms in our training. So make sure that you use plain language that everyone can understand, or at least in the beginning that we're using the full description of the words that we're referencing, right? Instead of all of the acronyms that we're accustomed to throwing at each other really, really quickly. An easy thing to overlook, but very important to making people feel like the material is accessible and that they're included. Another tip relating new information to existing knowledge or common experiences is very helpful, finding relatable stories or asking for their experience and trying to relate that back to them. And then using visuals like graphics, pictures, and videos, always helpful. Many organizations have training videos on YouTube that you can do a quick search and find some relatable content for inspiration or to recycle as well. And then we can also consider breaking up training into shorter sessions as well, especially if you have a program that has a much longer series of content to deliver. So breaking that up into smaller chunks so that volunteers are really retaining everything that you need them to. Many great resources available for orientation and training. A couple of my favorite, which was a lot of the content that I shared with you today from Galaxy Digital, which is the same site that United Way typically uses, like a Topeka Volunteers website. They also have a blog for volunteer management. And this Wild Apricot site is really wonderful as well. So I'm going to move into some time for some questions. Would be happy to answer, help troubleshoot for your specific programs, or just having a time to connect with your other volunteer managers and hearing their effective practices around orientation and training as well. And you're welcome to come off mute if you have anything you'd like to discuss or add.
I think this is just a good reminder. You know, even though we do kind of have a procedure, like you said, we kind of do often do it on the fly and like, you know, like throw people in. And so I think this is helpful just to really think about having a system and a plan and really trying to kind of stick with it. That's going to be my goal. You know, not once they're started like, oh yeah, and I forgot this form, and like just really kind of make that plan a little more, yeah, planful.
Well, I think that one of our strengths typically as volunteer managers, why we have these roles or on community engagement teams, is because we are able to do a lot of that peopling and support and putting out fires on the fly, right? And a lot of our organizations have things that come up every single day, and it is hard to plan ahead. And we kind of get into this system of always reacting to the situation at hand. And I think the more that we can take time to step away and really have some things on paper like this helps us with retention in the long run. When volunteers feel like we have our stuff together, it really goes a long way in helping them feel confident in us and in our organizations. So one, as you mentioned, Trista, like there are those papers you're like, oh, I forgot this form, or I forgot the press, or I forgot the photo release, things like that. It has always been really helpful for me to create folders, orientation or onboarding folders for everyone with the application, another copy of it in case I didn't get it during the screening and placement, or in case I didn't get one of the waivers at some point in time. So having all of that information together, the overview of the history, mission and vision of the organization, any of that community impact data that I mentioned, and then an overview of the programs as well. Having it all in one place, and you can just hand that out.
That's a great idea. That's what I jotted down while we were talking, is volunteer orientation folders. Yeah, we don't really have that. So I like that idea.
You also have to find time to make the folders, which is sometimes tricky.
Right.
but that's a great way that we can utilize other volunteers as well. I love finding some of our volunteers that are super passionate about our mission and asking them to come on board as maybe not often, but a new volunteer counselor, a new volunteer support coalition, and then helping them, enlisting them for help with the orientation and training, whether that's creating folders or actually helping them, having them help deliver the content. I think is super impactful for new volunteers to hear from regulars or veteran volunteers about their experience as well, and helps extend the capacity of your community engagement teams. Do we have other thoughts or questions, or are there pieces of your program you're like, we're doing this, but I wonder if there are ways to change that up? And I know I mentioned a tour is often one of my favorite opportunities during orientation to get a volunteer acclimated with the organization. I really can't emphasize enough how impactful a tour is if you have a facility with the that's appropriate for that, right? Often the things that come up on the tour are things that you walk by every day and don't even think about, but a volunteer might point something out. It's like, oh, hey, what's that for? And you're like, oh my gosh, let me tell you about this whole other piece of our programming, or what that is specifically for that they're pointing out. And I think it's a really, really wonderful way to informally meet other staff members. So sometimes that can feel really stuffy when you ask staff to kind of parade into the orientation room and introduce themselves. So sometimes you have to do that, and that's an appropriate thing to do. But I feel like the people you encounter throughout the building on your tour are typically in the middle of doing something. And so not only does a volunteer get to see what a day looks like in your organization, but also gets to see people hopefully really excited at their work and seeing them carry out the mission of the organization. And it makes them feel really special too, to kind of have a behind the scenes look at the organization and get to see people, you know, and say hi to them throughout their day. So if you're not doing that, I encourage you to find some ways that you could start incorporating that into your program. I'm curious, is anybody goal setting with their volunteers as part of the onboarding or orientation process? That can be a tricky one to incorporate, but I think super impactful and very supportive of the longevity of your volunteers. You know, sometimes we throw them into the work, which is super important, but asking them really why they're here and what they hope to gain, and helping them goal set. And it doesn't need to be goal setting like a team member, right? We don't need to pick 3 things and they're responsible for bringing in $30,000 of fund development, but just asking them why they're here and identifying ways to meet that goal. So I mentioned community connection might be one, but some volunteers are here for skill setting too, or skill advancement. So perhaps a volunteer is interested in learning a little more about public speaking, or feels like they're not confident in that. And so perhaps they can go with your team to a tabling event once a year, or perhaps they can speak on behalf of your organization at a Lions Club meeting. You know, looking for really creative ways to meet their goals, I think is super helpful in retention efforts as well, and making them feel like you value them enough to support their professional and personal endeavors is very, very important. All right. Well, I will start sharing again and share some commission announcements. If you have any more questions though about recruitment or, excuse me, or recruitment, any of the elements, if you have any more questions about orientation or training, please just stop me before we get off the call. Okay, can we see our community impact screen again, Global Volunteer Month screen? Perfect. The vision of the Kansas Volunteer Commission is to empower all Kansans to meet community need through service. And we do that through providing resources and leadership and to support local initiatives that tackle community needs across our states. You can go to www.canserve.ksde.org to find out more about our programs and resources. And registration for all of our monthly webinars can also be found on our website as well. We have the mentoring webinar series on the first Thursday of every month with Tierney Kirkdahl. She's our Mentor Kansas coordinator and often has a similar webinar as our volunteer engagement, inviting guests and community leaders to talk about mentoring practices for programs with kiddos K through 12, but also information that I find very applicable to all of our programming needs as well. So be sure to check that out. Our volunteer engagement webinar series, of course, is on the second Tuesday of every month. And then our civic engagement webinar series with Dr. Jessica Dorsey, our commission executive director, is on the third Friday of every month from 12 to 1. The Social Justice Capacity Building Mini Grant has been extended to June 16th. This grant is designed to help volunteer and mentor organizations build capacity around social justice. The commission strives to increase power, representation, and agency among historically marginalized communities through this grant. So this mini grant focuses on initiatives or projects that support both social justice and one of the following: access, inclusion, and participation in program services and opportunities, empowerment of individuals and communities to voice what is most important to them, or action to recognize injustice and navigate differences of power, privilege, and oppression. Additionally, our 9/11 National Day of Service mini grant opens July 3rd. The 9/11 National Day of Service and Remembrance is the culmination of an effort initially launched in 2002 by 9/11 family members and support groups who worked to establish the Charitable Service Day as a forward-looking way to honor 9/11 victims, survivors, and others who rose in service response to the attacks. In 2009, Congress designated September 11th as a National Day of Service and Remembrance and charged AmeriCorps, one of the programs of the Kansas Volunteer Commission, with supporting this effort across the country. With funding from AmeriCorps, the commission is working with organizations across Kansas to engage volunteers in tribute projects. So the grant guidelines for the 9/11 National Day of Service mini grant will be released on July 3rd. And for planning purposes, prior year guidelines and application materials can be requested by emailing volunteer@ksde.org for more information in advance for that grant if you are interested in applying. So extension on the social justice to June 16th, and then 9/11 opens on July 3rd. Mark your calendars for those dates. Thank you to everyone who participated in the Give Back Kansas Challenge, which ended on June 9th. Our winners will be announced once our team is done tallying all of the hours, the incredible hours that were put in through employer-sponsored volunteerism. It's going to take us a while because there are many, many hours logged, which is a wonderful, wonderful problem to have. And our next volunteer engagement webinar is on Tuesday, July 11th from 10 to 11 again, and we will be discussing volunteer supervision and would love to see you there. In the meantime, you can stay connected with us. Visit our website, www.canserve.org, and sign up for our monthly newsletter by emailing volunteer@ksde.org. You can also invite us to present to other groups that might benefit from the Commission's resources. We'd love to know about your tabling events. We'd love to speak at your conferences and to provide educational opportunities across the state. I've got one comment in the chat. not really goal setting, but we do try to make certain the volunteers are able to get connected with staff in areas they may not be volunteering, but they're interested in. I think that's a really, really wonderful point, Jean, being able to connect volunteers with other staff. Yeah, makes them feel very at home, very aware of the organization's mission. Very, very, very helpful. So thank you for that. Thank you all so much for joining us today. Have a great week, and we will see you next time.
Thank you.